اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله. يا أيها النبي الكوكب الدري أنت إمام الحضرة سلطانك الغيبي. يا أيها النبي الكوكب الدري أنت إمام الحضرة سلطانك الغيبي. لك العلا والسداد وشرف المؤبد وأنت يا محمد بدر الله وسني. يا أيها النبي الكوكب الدري أنت إمام الحضرة سلطانك الغيبي. جرت لك الأفلاك لذت بك الأملاك لولاك ما الأخلاق سندوسها المجلي. يا أيها النبي الكوكب الدري أنت إمام الحضرة سلطانك الغيبي. بدت بك الآثار ولا النهار جنابك المختار ضمن الضريح حي. يا أيها النبي الكوكب الدري أنت إمام الحضرة سلطانك الغيبي. همتك الفعالة ويدك الهطالة وأنت للرسالة أمينها القوي. يا أيها النبي الكوكب الدري أنت إمام الحضرة سلطانك الغيبي. همتك الفعالة ويدك الهطالة وأنت للرسالة أمينها القوي. يا أيها النبي الكوكب الدري أنت إمام الحضرة سلطانك الغيبي. صلاة ذي الإحسان عليك والخلان ما قامت الأكوان لكل نشر طي. يا أيها النبي الكوكب الدري أنت إمام الحضرة سلطانك الغيبي. صلى الله على محمد صلى الله وسلم صلى الله على محمد صلى الله وسلم. حطموا ظلم الليالي واسبقوا ركب أقبل السعد علينا والهنا من كل جانب. أقبل سعد علينا والهنا من كل جانب. فلنا البشرى بسعد فلنا البشرى بسعد جاءنا من خير ويب صلى على محمد صلى عليه وسلم. يا جمالا قد تجلى بالمشارق والمغارب. يا جمالا قد تجلى بالمشارق والمغارب. مرحبا أهلا وسهلا مرحبا أهلا وسهلا بك يا خير الحبايب. الله على محمد صلى الله وسلم. صلى الله على محمد صلى الله. يا شريف الأصل لذنا بك في كل النوائب. يا شريف الأصل لذنا بك في كل النوائب. أنت ملجأ كل عاص أنت ملجأ كل عاص. أنت مأوى كل تائب. صلى الله على محمد صلى الله وسلم. صلى الله على محمد صلى الله. وله الشكر على ما قد حبانا من مواهب. وله شكر على ما قد حبانا من مواهب. يا كريما يا رحيما يا كريما يا رحيما جد وعجل بالمطالب. صلى الله على محمد صلى الله وسلم. صلى الله على محمد صلى الله. من توجه نحو بابك ما رجع من ذاك خائب. من توجه نحو بابك ما رجع من ذاك خائب. واغفر ذنب عبد واغفر ذنب عبد قد أتى نحوك تائب. صلى الله على محمد صلى الله وسلم. صلى الله على محمد صلى الله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله.
الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم تسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we thank Him and praise Him for giving us the opportunity to spend this time learning His religion that He revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And we should always remind ourselves is the prophets came to rectify our lives, and they came to be a means for us to thrive here in this world before the hereafter. Their teachings are for the ma'ash and the ma'ad, and we tend to forget that. Their teachings are for this world, the world in which we live, and for the hereafter. And there is nothing more important for us than to understand what it means to live prophetically, prophetic living in any time. It just so happens that we live in a very particular time. And part of the affair of the believer is we need to strive not to be trapped in other people's boxes, such that we need to think out of their boxes. And we need to always set the frame right. Yes, the land in which we live now is run by with specific laws, and that there's specific people in charge. But we don't necessarily think of this land only as being a part of the country of the United States of America. These are ultimately the lands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there were prophets in these lands. And if you think about that, just that point, and we really need to understand history as sacred prophetic history. This is the true story of life and of history of humankind is prophetic history. And any manifestation where people turned away from prophetic principles and teachings, that is the aberration. The asl, the foundation, is striving to be like the prophets. Were we to have lived 10,000 years ago and been in these lands, we would have been required to follow the prophets that were sent to the people that were from here. And when you see things as such, it really changes your perspective. And you have the ability to understand what it is that you need to do given the current circumstances. And it's also very important to prevent ourselves from negative compromise in relation to the time and place that we are living. Compromise is not always negative, but it has to be principled. Compromise has to be principled. And there is no better example than the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ and his incredible sacred law for us to know exactly what principled compromise is, such that we can adhere to Allah in these times with all of its nuances. And permissibility has its place, and then doing what is recommended or best also has its place. This is why you and I need to be that broad-minded, not narrow-minded, and to understand is that the sacred of law and that all of the difference of opinion in it is a strength, and it relates to the universality of the teachings of our Prophet ﷺ, such that these teachings can not only exist in any given time or place, but they can also rectify any given time or place. And ultimately, when we talk about rectification, we're talking about human souls. And so much has come out of this when we talk about food and eating. And as is always the case with these topics, you realize that you simply just need more time. And having said that, we try to do our best to cover the most important topics that we can then put into practice, inshallah ta'ala. And we hope, as we've said this in one of the previous retreats as well, mechanisms will be put in place where we can review the material that we've taken, and that we can expand on it when we need to expand. And one of the big things that has come clear and will come clear, especially after a session like this, is the need for us to go into a lot more depth when it comes to food. Now, most of what we've taken thus far applies despite the food that it is that we are eating. Yes, there was some considerations there about permissibility and so forth that require us to go a little bit deeper. But this session here is an attempt to mention some important things that we need to know that are not auxiliary, they're right at the heart of this topic. And we're going to present certain things that aren't 100%, they're not all taken from the Yahya, but it's rooted in what Imam Al-Ghazali was trying to do in his last chapter of this book. He actually has a chapter that says that faslun yajmu adaban wa manahi tibbiya wa shar'iyya mutafarriqa, which essentially the last chapter he lists and he numbers them various benefits, and he calls them that adaban, so etiquettes, and manahi, things that you're not supposed to do, that tibbiya, so that is taken from medicine, and sharia, that we also learn in the sacred law, but they're mutafarriqa, they're various benefits that he wanted us to know about food. And some of them are still very helpful. I myself had to ask that Hakim Salim Khan about some of them because I didn't understand them, not having a background in medicine or nutrition. So some of them will be confusing when you read them. Some of them will make sense. But I felt that it was more important than that to just really emphasize this idea of the importance of diet. This is how we started on Friday night. And the biggest take home that we wanted people to have is to associate food and eating with deen. This is part of our deen. And as we've seen throughout these sessions and in the interactive sessions and in the reflection sessions, how true this really is, and how many things in the religious life relate to food. The food is really, really important. And especially that point that we were reflecting upon this morning, this idea of what differentiates us from the animal kingdom is that we do things with adab. We do things with manners. There's proprieties, there's etiquettes that we have to have. And when you do these things like eating with the proper adab, there's anwar, light that you receive in your heart as a result. And this light helps you live the reality of the deen, which is this is what we need to be doing. We need just to be living this deen. What we have to do here in the United States of America or in any geographical location in the world and in any time is actually very simple. In principle, we have to be. But when we say be, what we mean is to learn our deen, know it with absolute clarity, and then live it. Live up to those teachings. That is all we need to do. That in and of itself is the greatest form of da'wah, is simply living the meanings of the sunnah of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So let's just go back and remind ourselves of that verse that Imam Al-Ghazali mentions in his introduction. Ya ayyuha rusul, Allah is addressing the messengers. Oh messengers, kulu min at-tayyibat, eat from what is good and lawful. Wa'amalu salihan, and act righteously. So the whole goal in life is to act righteously so that we can come to know Allah and meet Him in a good state. And Allah is addressing the choice servants of His creation, the prophets and messengers, and commanding them to eat from what is good and lawful. And then to also act righteously. This is the essence of the matter. So diet is directly related to deen because as we've seen, if we're eating unlawfully, we could be making dua, but it's not going to be accepted. If we're eating from the shubuhat, we're going to be veiled, and that eating things that are unlawful, eating things that are of a doubtful nature, they not only veil the heart, but they harden it. And it prevents us from worship. And so this is something that you and I have to think very carefully about, and think about the state of food in the modern world, which we're going to talk a little bit about in the next bullet point. But then it's also understood from the hadith of our Prophet ﷺ, where he spoke about the mu'min al-qawi. The strong believer is better and more beloved to Allah than the weak believer. And there's good in both. And the main meaning of that is not physical strength. As Imam An-Nawawi says, is that the strength here is referring to the azimat an-nafs, the resolution that you have in your heart to prepare for the hereafter and to do things that will help you in the hereafter. And then he goes to list a number of these things. But all of the things that he lists, it's assumed that you also have to be physically strong. So even though the main meaning of the hadith relates to strength of intention, strength of resolution, it's also understood that it relates to physical strength as well. And this is one of the wisdoms why we know that when the companions came back into Mecca and Mukarramah and were performing tawaf, is that they put the top garment underneath their arm to show that they had not become weak, because they said that they've been in that Yathrib, and this was a place where there was a plague, so they've become weak. And they wanted to show them that they were not weak. And so there's something to be said for physical strength. And like so many other things in a pre-modern society, we have to go out of our way to achieve those things in our time. And this is what it means to understand these principles in light of the time in which we live. And part of that is food. You didn't really have to speak about organic food before modern industrial farming. They didn't have chemicals and they didn't have pesticides. They didn't have modern farming practices that needed to be eliminated. So the point here is that we have to go out of our way as a result, because of certain practices that have developed, that we are very sedimentary people. We don't move a lot. And people in previous cultures would get a lot more steps in. They didn't need Fitbits to motivate them to try to get 10,000 steps a day. This was very common for them, that they're walking to the masjid, they're walking that, and they're milking cows and milking goats and working and so forth. And they were naturally stronger. And if you do that, you don't have to get a membership to a gym and to work out in a particular way. And then you have the extremes that people go to. And when they actually do work out, what they're really going for, their forms, and to look a certain way, and to be big, or to be fit, and to have a flat stomach with a six-pack, and all of this type of stuff, which doesn't really matter. The point is to be healthy. And if someone is working out to keep your body strong, to assist you in worship, and to give you good mental health, these are all good intentions. And we should work out. And that's a whole other topic that relates to that healthy living. So the point here is that the hadith does also mean that we should try to be strong believers in physical strength as well. And part of that is health. How can you perform the Hajj, which is a very physical act of worship, if you're not healthy? And how can you pray into your later years if that you are not healthy? That Sheikh Mukhtar al-Maghrawi, may Allah preserve him, was telling me about that his Sheikh Muhammad Amin that till his last days he was praying standing. And he lived that to over 100. To his last days he was praying standing. That's amazing. Think about now what you have to do, and what a beautiful intention. Ya Rab, I'm going to stretch, to walk, to exercise, take care of myself, so that as long as I'm alive, I can use my limbs to worship you. And think about so many health problems that prevent us. Yes, the Sharia is that is based upon mercy. So that if you can't stand, then your prayer is still valid and there's that thing. But if you can worship Allah Ta'ala standing and make that intention to take care of yourself, it very well might be that Allah Ta'ala will honor you in that way so that you can remain praying till your last days, standing as we were meant to worship. So then we have the statement that we've already taken of Imam al-Ghazali. But again, just to emphasize and to hammer it into the heart one more time. The goal of the true people of understanding, the will albab, is to meet Allah Most High in the abode of reward. But there is no way to meet Allah without knowledge and action. And it is not possible to devote oneself to knowledge and action without a healthy body. The body will only remain healthy through food and nourishment, and partaking and eating to the extent needed over extended periods of time. And then we have a statement of Hippocrates, who's deemed to be the father of medicine. Nothing can be more important or necessary to know than the science of nutrition. So let your medicine be your food, and your food your medicine. How foreign is that to the poison that we're ingesting in our time? And then Ibn Sina, most illness, even those which lead the sufferer to the specialist, arises solely from long continued errors of diet and regimen. So these are some things to think about, and all of which indicate the importance of diet. And as we will see, and this came out a little bit in the interactive sessions, and I will say that there's probably a little bit more pressure on our sisters' shoulders when it comes to this than the brothers. Cultural expectations and so forth, that if you start going against the grain, but it's also on the shoulders of the brothers also face this. If you start going against the grain and you actually try to eat healthy, it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult. And in terms of the types of foods, in terms of the amounts of foods, it becomes difficult. But one thing that I found is if you're just considerate and you explain to people what you're doing and you educate people with mercy, sometimes, yes, people might just take that position where they just are upset and aren't going to accept it. But people tend to turn around, or at least will just kind of let you be. And then tact is all it's, if you're going to say that there's any trait of character that is close to being a karama, or like acting like a karama is a breaking of the norms, it's tact. Tact, we should do a whole retreat on tact. Tact is that Ratsul Hikmati and Mudara. The pinnacle of wisdom is Mudara. And there's a difference between Mudara and Mudahana. Mudahana is flattery. It's where you are that dealing with people in a way because you want more dunya. Whereas tact is that you are dealing with people in a certain way to protect your deen. And there's a huge difference between the two. Tact is where you know what needs to be done. But it's how tact is after you know what needs to be done, how you go about doing it. Okay, so many of us that converted, right after we converted, we weren't so tactful in the way that we were trying to give da'wah to our parents. I still have a flashback of within a year of conversion, being with my father and mother in a coffee shop and just saying, I'm going to give da'wah to my father. And this is what you don't do. And so you bring up the topic of religion and that, Dad, we're all going to die. Yes, son, we know we're all going to die. So, Dad, what are you doing to prepare for death then? Ya hawla wa la quwwata billah. My dad actually, his mom was Irish. She used to have a pretty bad temper. And in the middle, like we're in the coffee shop, in Flames Coffee Shop in San Jose or Willow Glen, California. And then he just hits the table with his fist, like, Kush! And like yells at me in front of everybody. It's like, don't you ever talk to me like that again. And he storms out the restaurant. And I was like, well, that was not the best way to give dawah. And I've known Uncle Hamza from within a year of becoming Muslim. And when we were living with Sheikh Abdullah with Ahmadna, and he came out from Philly. And he reminded me that I traded him a thobe, was it, for your book? I gave you 3 thobes for that? Subhanallah, you better get me back. No, that was a... Anyhow, mashallah, when you're young, sometimes you don't act in the most tactful manner. And that comes with age. But tact is really, really important in all of these things. Because it's not an option just to go along with everybody else is doing. You are going to have to go against the grain. As we mentioned before, sometimes it's harder for people with Muslim families than it is for people with non-Muslim families. Sometimes, depending upon the thing. The more and more that I sit with young people, and I've had this opportunity, especially in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt, and they tell me about what they're going through and how difficult things are. It's sometimes harder for high school age men and women in those societies to adhere to the deen than it is for us here, sometimes. And this is just mind-blowing, that what is happening throughout the world. And anyhow, so having said all of that, let's move to the next bullet point, which is the problem of food in the modern world. And there's so much that could be said here. I needed actually about 4 or 5 more hours to prepare for this. And so I might be a little bit all over the place, so please forgive me. I want to just present a few things and make a couple suggestions. There are quite a few good resources on this. And the first quote is taken from an article that was recently written by our dear brother, Sidi Ramiz Kent. May Allah Ta'ala protect him and preserve him. That he is the son-in-law of Sidi Muhammad, that Muhammad Abdul Bari, who is a part of our community here. And it's titled, Saving Truth in Beauty, the Destruction of Nature and the Islamic Solution. And he has a chapter in there that is subtitled, A Dilemma of History and Humanity. And he says, in his book, Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, Dr. Jared Diamond identifies 5 factors that have historically contributed to civilizational collapse: climate change, hostile neighbors, collapse of essential trading partners, environmental problems, and failure to adapt to environmental issues. He also lists 12 environmental problems facing mankind today, the first 8 of which have historically contributed to the collapse of past societies. So then he lists them. 1, deforestation and habitat destruction. 2, soil problems. And both of these, of course, relate to food. And so underneath soil problems, erosion, salinization, and soil fertility losses. Just do a Google search on how much soil every year is becoming unusable. And one great resource, and there'll be some things that I'm mentioning from it, is the Rodale Institute website. This is actually seemingly the very first, I think his name was John Rodale, was the one that coined the term organic. And that's, mashallah, like 15 minutes from here. And there's a wealth of resources, and they also, that his son was the one who coined this term, that regenerative organics, the idea of not just that organic, but regenerative soil. And far from depleting it, is it making the soil better over time. And the amount of topsoil that we are losing, they say that at this rate, we might only have 60 years left of farming, which is really, really scary. And so you can research that. So soil is key, because if you have soil that is depleted of nutrients and everything that needs to be in it in order to that make the food wholesome, how's the food going to turn out if the soil is not good? It begins with the soil. So these are huge human problems. Water management problems, overhunting, overfishing. Number 6, effects of introduced invasive species on native species. 7, overpopulation. 8, increased per capita impact of people. And then he says 4 new factors may contribute to the weakening and collapse of present and future societies. Anthropogenic climate change, i.e. human beings. Accumulation of toxins in the environment. Energy shortages. Full human utilization of the Earth's photosynthetic capacity. And that he says here is that the top 3 factors are all products of the sustained degradation of landscapes due to human mismanagement. So this is serious. And now this is not just talking about food, but you can see many of these 12 relate directly to food. Because you have to talk about environment, you have to talk about soil, and so forth and so on. And so this is a very serious predicament. And then if you would start levying a critique on the food industry itself and the practices. And Food Inc. is one good documentary that you can watch. And there's others as well. And when we did it here with a group of younger people, some of them had to leave the room because it was so troubling. And while on one hand that we have that a place like Rodale Institute very close by, on the other hand is that this is an area that has a lot of GMO corn and soybean, like right across the street, and that also that many of these that these mega chicken farms is that you see that all around us here, and some of the pictures that you see in a thing like Food Inc., it wouldn't probably be too far off in some of these places that are producing chickens. So this is really serious. And one of the things that we want to think about religiously, and they even say outwardly, that the wars of the 21st century are likely to be around resources. And we know that towards the end of time is that the Dajjal and his allied forces will have control of the majority of the world's resources. And then the Dajjal will be able to tell the sky that amtari fayumtar. He'll point to the sky and tell it to that rain, and it will rain. And this, of course, is not a proof of his that piety. This is a proof that he is the Dajjal. And we see this situation that very clearly developing. And just look at something like Monsanto. Research these things. What percentage of seeds have they patented? And this is serious stuff. And why did they develop something like the suicide gene, which is evil? So that instead of being able to reuse seeds, that you have to go back to them to buy more for every crop. And look at the state here in the United States of America with small farmers, and that what they end up having to do just to survive. And it's a serious, serious problem. Anyhow, there's a lot of that you can read into, but we should be aware of these matters. And we should recognize that it affects the food that comes onto our table. And then there's another thing here that was mentioned in a book that I'm definitely going to recommend. It's titled Food Between Curse and Cure. Islam, Health, and the Good Life is the subtitle. I really think everybody should get a copy of this book. It's very short, as you can see, and very helpful. And that it was that the name underneath here is Abu Munir Ash-Sha'ar. And then it was that research compiled and translated by that Mirza Abdurrahman Ashraf. And so this book is really, really helpful. And one of the things that he mentions here is that he points to a verse in the Quran where he says they warn people of the dangers of, quote, changing the creation of Allah. And this is mentioned in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا يُغَيِّرُنَّ خَلْقَ اللَّهِ وَلَا آمُرَنَّهُمْ فَلَا يُغَيِّرُنَّ خَلْقَ اللَّهِ. I will order them, and they will slit the ears of cattle and alter Allah's creation. So وَلَأُضِلَّنَّهُمْ وَلَأُمَنِّيَنَّهُمْ وَلَآمُرَنَّهُمْ فَلَا يُبَتِّكُونَ آذَانَ الْأَنْعَامِ وَلَآمُرَنَّهُمْ فَلَا يُغَيِّرُنَّ خَلْقَ اللَّهِ. I will certainly mislead them and delude them with empty hopes. Also, I'll order them, and they will slit the ears of cattle, which was a jahili practice, a superstitious practice, when they were going to visit the idols and alter Allah's creation. And so, this seems to be one of those manifestations. They say here, in the form of genetically modified organisms. So this is something that we really want to be weary of, and that we don't have to buy that argument that, oh, the earth already has too many people, is that we need to actually cut back on the number of people. And so you shouldn't have more children, and there's a limited amount of resources, and that if we don't develop these demonic agricultural practices, we're not going to be able to feed everybody. And a lot of this is based upon batil. We would conceive of these things very differently. And there are so many underlying assumptions to these arguments that are very easy to critique. And we are so well positioned to really provide, that alternatives that are well within the realm of possibility. And so they mentioned an example here. They warn people of the dangers, and he says here, in particular, the modern semi-dwarf wheat, which accounts for 99% of the world's wheat production and is the main ingredient in almost all meals, especially breads and sweets. There is an associated link between wheat consumption and chronic inflammation. They've also warned against rice and sugar, which too are linked to chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation, in turn, is linked to chronic diseases such as cancer, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disease, allergies, obesity, and many other diseases that, in one form or another, have afflicted most people in our times, except those upon whom Allah Most High shows mercy. So these are things that it's not an option to become complacent. And yes, it's hard. Just food itself, just even if you're convinced of this and know how to do it, it's still hard to do. Let alone if you're just shooting in the dark and don't know what you're doing. And so that we really need to develop workshops where you and I figure out what are things that we can do in light of this situation. And we have to go deeper where we really understand food in our day and age, and that we have to critique modern practices and be aware of them, not for the sake of critiquing them, but for the sake of doing what it is that we can do to protect our own selves and that helping other people that are around us. And there's a lot of different people, that Muslims and non-Muslims included, that we can work with on this project. So we'll pause there because there's so much else that could be said. And now we want to just look at a few principles of healthy eating. Now, much of this is taken from a manual a course that is offered by Hakim Salim Khan titled Life Balance and Healthy Living. Alhamdulillah, we've been privileged to have him come for several years to Al-Maqasid during COVID. He was actually here in the beginning of COVID in 2020 and hasn't been able to come back, but he'll be coming back again in May. And there will be several programs that are offered. Not all of them will be that solely focused upon diet, but this is right at the heart of this science. And I'll be quite honest, these programs, you'll find them life-changing, even if you just do the introductory level program. And there is so much benefit in them. And learning about the 6 lifestyle factors, which are air and environment, food and drink, physical activity and rest, mental activity and peace, retention and elimination, sleep and wakefulness. This is life-changing. That studying about temperaments is life-changing. These things are really important. And the Hakeem, I say this jokingly, but and it's not. I hope it's not disrespectful, but it's almost like I'm not really a movie guy, so you notice I don't really ever quote from movies. When I told someone, anyhow, the um the only way I think of it is like Karate Kid, which most of you probably, some of you probably don't even know what that is. Mr. Miyagi, the way that he was trying to teach his disciple, and the wax on, wax off, and getting him to to catch flies with the chopsticks and these types of things. And um, when I remember going to the first one, and here I am now that I've learned that my temperament is choleric, is that I come in with pen and paper in hand, ready to take notes. And the first thing he says is, "Okay, put all of your notebooks away. I don't want you to write anything." And at first, wait, but I'm going to lose the information, right? The whole weekend, nope, no notes. I want you to be present. Right? I want you to be present. And it just clicked for me. I was like, oh, this is the real deal. It actually clicked before that because my wife took the course before me when we were living in England, and she was in Leicester. And after the introductory stage, he wants people to learn the temperaments of spices by grinding them. So my wife came home and was like grinding spices. I was like, this is the real deal, right? Because like this is not just about information. This is about actually living it. And I remember that he came here in this room and did a session on parenting. And it was a weekend session. It was really, really beneficial. And it wasn't what I think we initially thought it was going to be. Because normally you're thinking about parenting, you're thinking about my kids. But he had all of us fill out a chart where you rate yourself on the 6 lifestyle factors. And then relative degrees of where we are on that. And he says, okay, so you want your kids to get to bed early, but you're getting to bed late. Oh, you want your kids to eat healthy, but you're not eating healthy. Oh, you want your kids to get off of social media, but you're on it all the time. It's ridiculous, right? You can't give someone something that you don't have. And it was kind of like, whoa. So we're thinking about parenting all wrong. We got to start with our own selves. In the first session, it was like 2 hours long. And he started to ask people about why they're taking the course. And this might have been for the other one. And then at first we thought he was only going to ask like 2 or 3 people. And then he went around and asked every single person. And by like the 4th or 5th or 6th person, you're like, whew, man, I know I like that person, but I'm not like, we got to hear everybody tell us why they're taking the course. And you could see people just were shutting off and like almost like started thinking like, oh my God, what did I do? I just spent money on this. This is not what I came for. And he's really good when it comes to, he's like, look, if you all want a refund, I'll give you a refund. You don't have to stay. But then the next session he comes back and he says, how's everybody doing? Everyone's fine, okay. It's really hard to listen to people, isn't it? He did it intentionally. It's really hard to listen. He's all, you all want to be health practitioners? This wasn't for the parent one. This was for the introductory bro. He's all, you all want to be health practitioners? And you can't even listen to people? How are you going to be a health practitioner? What a lesson. What a lesson. Like we find it difficult to listen to people for more than 10 minutes. And we want to be able to help people. You can't help people if you're not willing to listen and to really hear people and to let them that tell you that their perspective and what they're going through. And then, of course, you can provide them solutions. So he has a whole section in here on food and drink. And it's extremely helpful. So some of what we have here is taken from that. And so the first principle of healthy eating is to eat with a righteous intention. And we've spoken, some of these things have already been mentioned. And we make the intention to eat to strengthen ourselves for worship. Consciously, we make that intention. And then the next is, and again, this was touched upon, but we're going to go a little bit deeper here, is that eating from what is lawful and good. The first consideration with food is that it has to be halal. And what that means is the food itself is halal, i.e., permissible to eat. The way we acquired that food is halal, and the money that we use to purchase it is also lawful. So those are the three considerations. And that requires a little bit of work to learn, according to one of the schools of Islam, what is considered to be permissible. And alhamdulillah, with the differences of opinion, it makes things easier for us. So, for instance, the ingredient that you see in many dressings, red wine vinegar, in the Shafi school, that's problematic because you can't have any agent put in vinegar to put in wine to change it to vinegar. But in the Hanafi school, even if you put in an agent, that it's still permissible. So these differences of opinion make it easy for us, okay? And the Hanafi school, they're strict for anything that's not specifically fish from the ocean. And the that Shafi school is that anything from the ocean, so octopus and squid and shrimp and lobster and all kinds of other stuff, right? Calamari, these things are all permissible in the Shafi school. So there's nuances there, and we need to familiarize ourselves with that. And so the first criterion is what is halal, okay? But that's the baseline. And one thing that we want to remember here is it's like Imam Ghazali says in terms of our prayers, and that your prayer is a gift that you're giving to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So that if you're gifting Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala something, and that imagine using the metaphor of gifting a king a horse. The horse is alive, but it's missing an eye. One of its legs is broken. It has a big wound on its belly and doesn't walk very well. Okay, the horse is alive, but you're going to give a gift like that to a king? That's not the type of horse that you're going to gift a king. Right? That's going to cause a bigger problem than not giving him a gift at all. And so when we gift our prayers, yes, the obligations are the most important part. They're the vital organs that without them there's no life. But then the sunan are like the limbs that we need to have. So you can live without an arm, but there's a serious deficiency in the person as a result. And then the adab are like the different ways of beautifying things. And so similarly, this is how we should see in terms of eating. Just because we're doing that criterion of halal, we want to go beyond that. And this is where then tayyib comes in. And as some scholars have said, is that when we say halal and tayyiban, some of them say that both refer to permissibility. And they differentiate halal being permissible to eat in of itself, and some of them will say tayyib means the way that you acquired it. Okay, so essentially both relate to permissibility, but from different perspectives. That's one opinion. That others say that tayyib relates to how delicious something is, the taste of it. And so, yes, wholesome, and that's understood, but also in terms of being delicious. And that when you eat real good food, that it tastes good. It tastes different. And as opposed to food that is GMO food, that from soil where the nutrients are depleted. You eat it, but it doesn't get you full. And it doesn't have a taste. Try eating, tomatoes is not my favorite food. But when you eat like a tomato, I remember having a tomato in Turkey one time. And it's like, my God, this is amazing, right? And Turkey is a country that has outlawed GMO foods, as that country should. And so the point here is that It's noticed. Ask your parents, ask people that have lived overseas. Food tastes better for the most part overseas, right? And there's something about the wholesome nature of that food that also tastes good. So that is another meaning of tayyib. But then Imam Al-Razi says there's other dimensions as well. In order for food to be tayyib, it has to be acquired in a lawful manner, but also, excuse me, it's pure. And the purity comes from the remembrance of Allah in the process of the food chain. And that from the time that we plant a seed, while we're tilling the crops, to the time of harvest, when the animals are being raised, when the food is being prepared, when the food is being served, when the food is being consumed. Imagine if in that whole chain there was a remembrance of Allah, how different things are going to be. That's part of it being tayyib. And then he also says, it's that which is healthy for the body and good for the mind. Healthy for the body and good for the mind. So these are two added dimensions. And this might be where we want to talk a little bit about that food being organic. And I highly recommend that everybody, that the Rodale Institute is a really good resource, and there's probably many resources like this to look at what they have said about organic foods. This is something that is we should all be familiar with. And they say the following on their website: organic agriculture is a production system that regenerates the health of soils, ecosystems, and people. So that's a positive way of defining it, not as just what it's not. The essential difference between organic and conventional farming is that conventional farming relies on chemical intervention to fight pests and weeds and to provide plant nutrition. That means synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. Organic farming relies on natural principles like biodiversity and composting instead to produce healthy, abundant food. And so GMOs are not allowed. If something's labeled USDA organic, you know that it's not GMO. And because of the food lobby, they weren't able to label it such. And so then there's that new label that you see on some foods where the GMO project, where you know that it's not GMO, but that's another label that is developed. So there's a whole bunch of other considerations when we really talk about what it means to be organic. But this is why we should be involved in this. So you talk about soil health, things like cover crops, things like crop rotations, not just planting the same crop in the same place year in and year out. Crop rotations, compost, organic no-till, because when you just till with these big machines, that it exposes the soil to earth conditions, which then might take from its biodiversity and that its ability to provide good soil. Pest management, livestock management, and rotational grazing. So we used to have here that portable chicken coop, and chickens eat and then they poop, but it's good fertilizer. And then you have them eat and poop and then move them around and they eat and they poop, and their poop is very good fertilizer. Anyhow, these are some of the considerations, and we should just know that in general and then go a little bit deeper. But then there are other considerations that you might want to add as well to this idea of tayyib. And these are things like eating locally. These are things like eating seasonally, making sure that it's cruelty-free, things like fair trade. So this gets a little bit like, oh my God, like how am I going to actually do this? This is not meant to overwhelm, but this is meant to make us aware so that we take the next step and try our best. At least we're aware and we're willing to try our best. But all of these are considerations of tayyib in our modern context. And then you might even include this in this as well, eating according to temperament. And this is where it starts to get very detailed. And this is part 2 of the course. This is the other manual where it's for the practitioner training, where it starts to go food and drink much, much deeper. And this is what you're going to need if you're going to become a naturopath or a nutritionist and actually help people heal through food and so forth. And he talks about the different tastes and their effects. So whether it's sweet, bitter, salty, pungent, sour, astringent, acrid, oil or greasy, bland. And then learning your own temperament and what foods are good for your temperament and the times of day that you should be eating and according to seasons and all these different things. But you just see what a mess that it is in the modern world. What is the average distance that the meal travels? It's like what, 3,500 miles or something like that we eat? And the foods tend to be packaged and all these other things that are typical of the Western diet. These are problems, and this is why people are so sick. Even if in general we're living longer because of that, the type of that medications that people are on and so forth, and for other reasons, it doesn't mean that there's quality of life, and that it's much better to live a quality life full of barakah. We know we're going to die anyway. What is the purpose of prolonging life if there's not quality of life and you're not living for the right purpose? We're going to die anyway. And this whole idea of just, I want to live as long as I possibly can. I'm not saying that you don't want to live long. Take care of yourself. But we want to live a good quality life for the sake of Allah and die when it's best for us to die. And in general, we ask Allah for a long life. But we want quality of life. In quality of life, not just in terms of our health, but in terms of how we're practicing our religion. And that our Prophet told us not to desire death. He says, but if you must say, oh Allah, allow me to live as long as it is good for me to live. And then the one time that it's permissible to ask Allah to take you is in a time of fitna. That وَإِذَا أَرَدْتَ بِعِبَادِكَ فِتْنًا فَاقْبِضْنِي إِلَيْكَ غَيْرْ مَفْتُونٍ. And if you want to try your servants, take my soul unto you, that not falling into that tribulation. And so, we live in a time of extreme fitna. And hopefully that we can respond to that by that being firm on our deen and helping people get out of that. So these are just some considerations there of how we want to start. So first of all, to repeat that, it starts with eating with the right intention, with a righteous intention. Secondly, eating what is halal and tayyib in all of those meanings. Now, this is just the beginning, and think about the work that we have to do there just to get that right. The next consideration, the next principle that is eating according to a schedule. Schedules are good, health-wise. Eating at certain times of day, having a regime, having set times when you eat. And part of that is not eating too late at night, allowing yourself time for digestion in the evening. So eating according to a schedule, having set meal times in a schedule, and you might even want to plan out the week. And in general, we should always eat simple foods. If you're eating on a daily basis, for guests, if you want to serve a little bit more, that's fine, as long as we're not unnecessarily burdening those who are cooking the food, and there's no takalluf, where we're doing too much beyond our means. Doing a little bit more for guests with righteous intentions is fine. But on the day-to-day, we should eat simply. The more simple, the better. It does not have to be a 4-course meal. Eat simply. Have 1 or 2 things of food. And this is actually better for your health. And maybe plan out a schedule of how it is that you want to eat. So eating according to a schedule. And something we've touched on throughout the weekend, being present while eating. When we eat, this is not a time to be distracted. This is a time to be present. And closely related to that is what the Hakim recommends: not eating when upset, excuse me, tired, or in front of the TV, computer. Now, sometimes you can't just turn off the switch like, okay, I'm not going to be upset anymore. All right, I'm tired. I'm just going to turn it off. No. But in general, these are things that we want to consider. And as you will find, I am not claiming in any way that I put this into practice, by the way. I'm trying. I believe in its importance, and I'm trying. And sometimes I'm not even going to claim that I'm trying, but I know that I should be trying if I'm not trying. So these are things to consider, though, and to remind myself first and foremost and others. Eating freshly cooked or prepared foods. This is really important. To the extent that we can avoid eating out, it's better. To the extent we could avoid eating out, it's definitely better. If you have to cater, it's better to find someone who can cater from their home. If you have to use a restaurant, use people that you trust. And then, if that's not possible, it's still permissible to cater from Chipotle and Panera Bread and these types of things, which we sometimes do for these retreats. But it's far from ideal. Far from ideal. Eating freshly cooked or prepared foods. The Hakim himself has a refrigerator, but he doesn't ever really use it. He tries to cook his food fresh for every meal. And it doesn't negate the fact that you can cook a soup, for instance, and then eat it for like 2 or 3 days straight. That is something that you can also do. But in general, eating freshly cooked or prepared foods. And then we've mentioned this before, but it's important to reemphasize because it's important in terms of our deen, but also in terms of our digestion, chewing food properly. And on average, you're going to want to chew food 21 times. Actually, try it. Really try it. Food has different consistencies, so sometimes you do a little bit less, sometimes you have to do a little bit more. Try and chew to the point where it's lost all of its flavor and it basically starts to dissolve on the back of your mouth, and then you can easily swallow it. And then catch yourself. Notice when you actually want to take your next bite. So you'll want to probably take your next bite around 10 to 13 chews. And so this is where the nafs comes along, because why am I going to sit here and chew it when I can taste the next bite? That's now disciplining the soul when you're eating. So resist the urge just to swallow at 10 or 12 or whatever, and then take your next bite. Chew it thoroughly. And then hakada. Resist the urge also, too, in terms of size of bites. And then not eating too much. And the principle here is that before it becomes uncomfortable. Before it becomes uncomfortable. And Ustad Amjad mentioned that one of the wisdoms of the way that the Prophet used the 2 sunnah ways of sitting is the Prophet would sit on his legs like this, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or he would put his pressure on the left leg and raise his right leg up. These are the 2 sunnah ways that we know he used to sit, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's not disliked to sit cross-legged. That's better than sitting in a chair, and nor is it haram to sit in a chair. But that is the sunnah. And it's good to accustom ourselves to that, at least so that we've done it for part of our lives. And then if we go to people's homes, or at times if we have people over, there's no harm in sitting at tables. But it's a good thing spiritually to have everything that the Prophet ﷺ did be more beloved to us. That's a good thing. We actually want that. And then there's a beautiful story in the seerah that Muqawqis, the king of Egypt, sent to the Prophet ﷺ a doctor. He sent him a gift, and he sent him a doctor who could serve their needs. And what did the Prophet ﷺ say to this doctor that was sent to them? So he would have known that he would have been, that having worked for the king, very familiar with some of the main techniques and practices of his time, would have been very skillful. And so the Prophet ﷺ sent him back. He says, "Irja ila ahlak, go back to your family. Nahnu qawm, we are a people. La na'kul hatta najur, we don't eat until we become hungry. Wa idha akalna la nashba', and if we eat, we don't eat to satiety, where we've taken our full." He said, "We're not in need of you. Go back." Normally, you would have thought that it would be very nice to have the Prophet said, "We are a people that we don't eat until we're hungry, and when we eat, we don't take our fill. Khalas. We don't need a doctor." And what wisdom in that? Look at that practice. If you just took that principle right there, don't eat until you're hungry, and when you eat, don't take your fill. SubhanAllah. And that's one of the next principles that we have. Not eating again until the first meal is digested, which usually takes about 6 hours. Okay? And resting after lunch and walking after dinner, if possible. These are recommendations. And the advice is إذا تتعشى إذا تتغدى تمدى, that if you eat lunch, then take a nap, relax a little bit. وإذا تتعشى تمشى, if you eat dinner, then take a walk. And so summarizing and then ending the meal with a prayer, which is the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ, and that way we could show gratitude for what it is that we have eaten. So in summary, there's many considerations here that we have to look deeper into. But if at least we understand the broader categories, the permissibility of food, the quality of the food, the quantity of the food, the manner of eating, the time of eating, and the psychological state of the person while eating. These are all important principles that we want to consider. And you can see that we fall short. And then also look how important eating is to the religious life when we think about it from that particular perspective. And one of the beautiful things about this book in Food Between Cure and Curse, they have a series of foods that to avoid. And I really like this book as a way of trying to be balanced. The Hakim mentioned to me that he felt a lot of the modern diets are kind of typical of the imbalanced nature of the modern world. That really sets well with me. That doesn't mean that we don't do them for a short period of time, but for long term is that we have the prophetic diet. We're not in need of these other diets. The only caveat there is some of the prophetic foods, which is the last bullet point. What does it mean to drink milk in the modern world? That doesn't mean that many of these things on the shelves that are filled with terrible chemicals and homogenized and so forth and so on, right? Dairy is one of the big problems of that, and how to, that you say the Prophet ﷺ drank milk, that this is not the milk that the Prophet ﷺ drank. That I know the type of milk that is directly from a cow. In Mauritania, I used to have a cow, and what they do there is that they milk the cow and they drink it immediately. That's real milk, and it's powerful, and it is amazing. The taste of it is amazing. Literally, you warm up the mahalaba, the thing that you milk the cow into, or the goat. I used to milk the goats too. But then you put it in, and so it's a little bit warm, and you drink it right on the spot. And yes, sometimes they save the milk and put an agent into it, so it becomes leban ra'ib, sour milk. And that also is very delicious and very good. It allows it to last a little bit longer. But then the real butter was, and this was that you would see the people doing this, they would put milk in a small water skin, and then they'd go like this, whoosh, shake it like this. And then the butter would come to the surface of the milk. And then they would dip fresh dates in that butter. Ya Allah. City dwellers, they're the miskeen ones. These people are living it up. This is one of the, like, what other food do you possibly want than fresh butter that is from fresh milk with fresh dates? It is delectable. I don't even know what word to use for it. It is delicious and wholesome and healthy, and the way that it makes you feel is different, right? Anyhow, that's what was I talking about? How do we get on that topic? Milk. Aywa. But what was I talking about before there? I need to wrap up here because it's already 12:30. Foods to avoid. Thank you. There's just certain things that we want to rid our life of. When we talk about principles of healthy eating, we want to rid our life of fast food. We should try to rid our lives of that. Try to rid our lives of GMO food. And that there's certain foods you can look on the Dirty Dozen, just look it up. Those are foods that you want to avoid and try to buy organic. And as we've been speaking all along, yes, there's serious problems in our society about accessibility to good, nourishing food. And we have to be at the forefront of changing that. We should be as Muslims. And that people need to be involved with that, and we need to spread awareness of that. And to the extent possible that we can avoid processed food, it's also good. These are just simple principles that it becomes very difficult. So much of our food is so highly processed. And that in the process, so much of the nutrition of that food is lost. And then white sugar. You really, really need to replace devilish white sugar, and it is devilish. Just look at the way that white refined sugar was tied to the slave trade to know how devilish it is. Devilish from its origins and its onset. And so this thing is and it's horrible for your health. We should rid ourselves of white refined sugar, and even organic sugar, only use it to the extent that it is needed, and then find alternative ways of sweetening food. Honey and that coconut sugar and that other ways that it actually still tastes good. Dates. You don't need to put sugar in. Have a smoothie, sweeten it with a couple dates, and it tastes just as good, but actually better. You don't even need these other sweeteners. And it's super healthy for you. And it won't raise your sugar level or cause diabetes. It's very different. Anyhow, unhealthy vegetable oils and fats. We shouldn't use canola or corn or soy or sunflower or safflower or grapeseed or these types of things. Use healthy oils. And even if it's a little bit more expensive, that it's better to invest in a slightly healthy oil. And then in general, familiarize yourself with the quote-unquote Western diet of prepackaged foods and refined grains and processed meat and high sugar drinks and candy and sweets and fried foods and all of these other types of things. And replace it with a better diet. And inshallah ta'ala, this is a means for us to be more healthy. And then the principles of healthy drinking are fairly simple. That drink sitting, take 3 measured intakes. And if we can wait till about 30 minutes after a meal, that's better. And that there's a few others that could be mentioned. And finally, the prophetic diet. Al-Mutarif, may Allah bless him, mentioned some of the aspects of that during his session. But there's a few principles that we know are from his sunnah. And one relates to wholesome food, which we've been discussing. 2 relates to that moderation, which is exemplified in that statement that he said when the doctor was sent to him. And part of that is also avoiding waste. But then the foods that our Prophet ﷺ ate, this is a beautiful thing to have modern versions of these types of foods that the Prophet ate. And the lovers, despite culture and not being wrong to have certain foods for certain cultures based upon certain geographical locations, but believing that the foods of our Prophet ﷺ are superior. Everything about him was superior. It doesn't negate cultural food. It doesn't negate food in a particular geographical location being good for those people. But these foods are, if you will, type of universal foods because these were the foods of the Prophet ﷺ. And that bringing in these into our lives will bring immense benefit. And this is what we want. Things like ajwa dates, because there's a hadith that relate to them. Things like using olive oil and honey, vinegar, barley, and then certain things like pumpkin and squash, dates and figs, and so forth and so on, grapes, and that real milk. These are things that we should bring into our diet. If we do so with the intention of following the Prophet ﷺ, huge doors will open up for us, not only in terms of our physical health, but also in terms of our spiritual health and love and connection to the best of creation. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I apologize, we're a little bit all over the place. This is what we were able to prepare for this last session. Everything that was just mentioned, we need to refine it further into that. If I didn't say anything that was precise or I made a mistake, please do forgive me. And if anyone has any comments, you can post that in the questions. I think I've already taken up our Q&A time now. So please do still post your questions, and we'll try to get to what we can from them in the final closing session. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala.